And so our next presenter of the morning is Cole Larance, who is presenting the work, We're Going to Need a Bigger Beach, a stakeholder analysis of land-based shark fisheries in Florida and Texas. This is advised by our faculty, Paul Seelbach, with reader Stuart Soroka.
Awesome. So can everybody see my screen here?
Yes.
Cool. So thank you for that introduction. This is my thesis project on land-based shark fisheries. And unlike this guy who you may recognize from the movie Jaws, I, during my investigation, was focused on land-based shark fisheries in particular. This is a very good example of a picture that was submitted to me through one of my survey respondents. So for a little bit of context, how to, I guess, is you're going to need obviously some land to engage in this activity, as indicated by the name. That takes the form of either a beach, a pier, or a jetty. And to deploy baits, anglers usually utilize kayaks, or in some small instances, drones. Some very heavy-duty fishing gear, like that 20-aught hook in that hand, as you can see, and also some very large baits. And this is all made possible because sharks naturally, they do come very close to shore. And so anglers usually deposit baits about 10 to a few hundred yards offshore. And so why specifically am I doing land-based shark fishing? I have a little bit of interest personally in this. I've been fishing for a while and started engaging in land-based shark fishing in my last year of high school. And so why is someone from Michigan engaging in land-based shark fishing? Well, it's sort of connected to a larger trend in the fishery, which can be related to internet sensations and YouTube videos. And lots of people have been engaging in the fishery in the last 1 to 4 years and also the last decade. And this has caused some conflicts between stakeholders in the fishery, which I studied here. And it is sort of characterized by a movement to ban shark fishing in a lot of municipalities in Florida. And so as a problem solver, I figured, hey, let's go try to see what we can do to ameliorate these issues. And to do so, one needs research and data. And I found that in the current literature, there's a need, especially for research on the human element of this fishery. There have been a few studies, but those mainly related to the conservation ethics, and there are still many significant gaps in knowledge. And so both the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, also as FWC, they need data to do their job adequately. And so why are there gaps in knowledge? Well, it relates to, one, the nature of land-based shark fishing. As you can see in the picture, it is usually done at night, and also instead or contrary to like boat-based shark fishing, which everyone needs to come back to a marina, a concentrated location where anglers or angler managers and researchers can distribute surveys or talk to people. This can be done on any of the hundreds of miles of beaches in either state. Also, observing practices online is getting harder as the public forums are dying. That's a quote from one of my survey respondents. And this is possibly because of fear of punitive action based on the state. And so this is hard to study and hard to regulate. And so there is a clear need here for cooperative and possible solutions. So my investigation tried to investigate this hard to investigate fishery. First, by looking into the current land-based shark fishing environment. Second, gauge the status of relationships between stakeholders in each state. And also I tried to identify points of agreement on actionable solutions for the future. My overarching approach here was utilizing co-production, which involves stakeholders from the very inception of this project and throughout the whole process. So how did I choose stakeholders? It was based off of two main factors, involvement and feasibility. And so these are the three most involved stakeholders in each state. You have the managers, who obviously manage the fishery, land-based shark anglers who engage in it, and research-oriented conservationists, which sort of play a third-party research role. And feasibility is the reason that I excluded the public from this, is because there's not really a concentrated way to gauge public opinion. And I just assumed that the public movements to ban the shark fishery were indicative of the most influential players in that party. And so why did I choose Texas and Florida? These are the hot spots for land-based shark fishing on the East and Gulf coasts. and they present key regulatory differences, which make them very interesting case studies for seeing the effects of different management approaches in these states for land-based shark fishing specifically. So first, I collected data through a land-based shark angler survey that I created with the help of stakeholders. It was broken into 3 parts. The first part related to just general trends in the fishery and practices. The second part related to relationships between anglers and their respective government management agency. And the third part related to the relationship between conservation practices and conservationists. And I distributed this first, I attempted to through public and private groups on social media. And there was sort of a lackluster response. And so I wanted to increase my response rate. And so in Florida, there was the opportunity to utilize a public records request and got the list of all shore-based shark fishing permit holders, which is around 18,000 people. And I send out a batch of emails to a randomized sample of a little more than 5,000 of those to get a few hundred responses back. That information is not accessible in Texas. And so I had to utilize a snowball distribution method through some of my stakeholders to distribute the survey that way. So in total, I got 338 responses, which is heavily, it's more on the Florida side of things, a few hundred from Florida and around 40 from Texas. And so that presents some obvious limitations to my data. Here are some photos that were submitted from anglers. It's just a little fun opportunity for them. And I complemented the survey responses with long form stakeholder interviews. I interviewed 1 key stakeholder from each group in each state for a total of 6. I won't go into their qualifications, but just trust me, they're all very qualified in their respective areas. And so now for some of my results. In Florida, there are much tighter regulations with regard to the land-based shark fishery. Whereas Texas just matches the federal recommendations, Florida has gone further to implement a number of restrictions, most notably the shore-based shark fishing permit system, which I referenced earlier, which necessitates that anglers must take a full course on shore-based shark fishing, as they refer to it. Then they must pass a quiz, and then they get a permit, which is free, but it is an additional step. There's also a ban on chumming, which is the practice of throwing like guts or blood into the water to supposedly attract sharks, which I found it doesn't actually work. It's more something to appease the public. And then also there are more harvest prohibitions in Florida. Most notably, you're not allowed to harvest or kill hammerhead or tiger sharks, which are trophies for many land-based shark anglers. And also the previous conflicts with the public that I mentioned earlier seem to have somewhat died down in the previous or in the recent years. And so for Texas, Texas is just different, as Dr. Banks said from the Texas A&M Heart Research Institute. They have different access to beaches. As I said, the regulations are much more lax, and there's less conflict with the public, as I found. This is indicative of the Texas shark fishery. One specific difference here is you're allowed to drive cars on the majority of beaches in Texas, where it's the opposite in Florida. And that allows people to bring their homemade shark racks and fish a number of different rods at one time. Some results from the angler profile. In Florida, while there's obviously a large contingent of anglers from Florida, there's a very significant portion of anglers that come from out of state, like me, that make up that fishery. I found that it was 33.7%, and that's just a few point off from the state's data on the matter. Demographically speaking, the average angler is a 39-year-old white male. It's a very male-dominated fishery and very white at about 90%. Texas, at least from my survey, all of the respondents resided in the state of Texas, and there was no demographic data because the state doesn't provide it, or they do provide it, but I cannot access it as a public citizen. And so there actually did happen to be a lot of overlap between the anglers in each fishery. The majority of anglers in both states engage in catch and release fishing, which you catch a shark and then obviously release it, send it back instead of killing it to either hang up or eat. The motivation of these anglers is recreation based. As I referred to earlier, there's a large influx of land-based shark anglers with which most anglers reported having 1 to 4 and 5 to 9 years of experience. And most of these anglers do so infrequently. So here's a very quick story that I thought was very cool. This man is Captain Billy Sandifer. He is credited with flipping the land-based shark fishery in Texas from a predominantly harvest or predominantly kill to a predominantly catch and release fishery within 1 year when he changed his own practices, and because he's sort of a legend and household name there. So some of the results of the angler and state management relationship. In Florida, there's a healthy dialogue between the state and land-based shark anglers, which was characterized by the interviews that I did and also the survey. As you can see, there's a positive relationship between the survey respondents. Among 254 respondents to this specific question, majority said somewhat good or extremely good. Also, the current regulations are very popular, which is sort of different here in terms of communication than Texas, where there's a lack of communication, not necessarily because of a lack of effort, though. Perry Trial from Texas told me that despite holding 5 scoping meetings across the state management officials were not able to get even 1 attendee. Despite my sample, which I believe is more conservation oriented than the fishery, possibly because of self-selection bias, they were still divided on whether or not the Florida permit system is the proper way to approach regulation. So just generally less positive overlook and outlook on regulations. So finally, the angler and conservation relationship. In both states, there are connections with research-oriented conservationists that are third party. In Texas, this takes the form of tournaments in which anglers hold their own tournaments and then they provide data to a conservationist. In Florida, that does not happen, but there are still independent relationships. And in Texas, the relationship is key because of the lackluster relationship with the state. And so people at the Texas A&M Heart Research Institute, who I talked to, said that investing in, quote, face time and their ability to specialize, whereas the state is not, is really the key here. And so between both states, land-based shark anglers also consider themselves conservationists, which was another interesting finding. And so overarching notable findings here, we are not, in fact, going to need a bigger beach because there are many opportunities for collaboration and problem solving in the future. All stakeholder groups wanted more communication. And this is not an indictment of the current system saying that they can't. It's just that there's a lack of awareness of opportunities. Each state has a very distinctive stakeholder interaction web. In Florida, shark anglers they feel very comfortable going to either conservationists or the state directly through a number of online or in-person forums. In Texas, shark anglers really only interact with the conservationists, the third-party conservationists, in this instance, academic. And then those conservationists can utilize the data and the trends that they find and relay them to the state for management purposes. And the key here is the face time that third-party conservationists can invest in this fishery. Also, there's a significant opportunity to expand cooperative shark tagging, which is land-based shark anglers tagging sharks for conservation purposes. In Florida, possibly Texas, but specifically for Florida, I found the number of shark anglers that engage in shark tagging is much less than those that indicated that they would like to in the near future. So some implications for management here. More regulations and enforcement are not necessarily efficient and or feasible. As I said earlier, this fishery has a number of factors that make it very hard to regulate directly. So we need alternative ways to increase compliance. Some opportunities and solution here, as I said earlier, expanding shark tagging, which one addresses the need for data, both biological and the human elements of the fishery. 2, the current infrastructure already exists through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And 3rd, this would naturally encourage conservation and regulatory compliance, according to the literature. Also, some final opportunities. There's more communication and with marketing and awareness. And so this could take the form of tournaments held in partnership with researchers or state management officials in Florida, where there currently is none, which would increase awareness, allow for possible regulation. It was done in a short-term context, and data collection. And finally, there's current infrastructure utilized in Texas for the red snapper fishery that I think would provide a good model for shark fishery. It's an app called iSnapper that anglers can report data on their catches and their own practices, which I think would be much more popular than it is with the snapper fishery if it was utilized for shark fishing, and could be utilized in both states. And so that was my presentation. Some quick acknowledgements. Thank you for my research advisor, Paul Seelbach, who has done quite a bit of fishery research in his own day and currently still does. My reader and all the stakeholders. And Jason, thank you very much for the amazing seminar class. And then finally, for my mom for showing me how impactful research can be on the lives of actual people. So, questions?
Great job, Cole. We have time for a couple of questions.
Well, I have a couple. I don't want to be the only
Please do.
one, but I have a couple. So I'm Paul Seelbach, and I again worked with Cole along the way, who did a fabulous job. So do you have a sense from interacting with the stakeholders, the researchers and managers in these two states, do you have a sense of how your survey, kind of your intervention into their world, will make a contribution to them? Is this a isolated undergraduate thesis report, or do you think you stimulated them in some way through stepping into their world?
Yeah, we're continuing to have a dialogue. I just sent this back out to all of them, and they will most likely watch the recording. But from the inception of this project, at least in Texas, my bar was low. One of the stakeholders said that literally anything will help. And so I assume that I only presented like a small amount of the data I collected. There was quite an extensive survey with a lot of respondents. And so there's a lot of opportunities there for the future to utilize that data.
Yeah, so
and specifically the perspectives on policy, which I think is sort of unique.
I guess what I'm thinking is, in addition to your actual product, you also built those relationships. Right. And you sort of stimulated their thinking along with the report itself. My other question is, the classic approach to fisheries management and with concerns about harvest and harvest mortality is to have a lot of research on the populations and the population mortality and the mortality from fishing. And there's some indirect stuff in your survey, but your work didn't really deal directly with that classic fisheries sort of mathematics of population dynamics and mortality. So I'm just wondering, sort of what are your thoughts on the state of knowledge on shark populations in these areas, fishing mortality, and what's the relative role of the shore-based fishery relative? And I understand you don't have hard data on all this, but just I'm wondering what your understanding is, shore-based fishery relative to like a boat fishery. What do we know about these things?
There actually is some hard data on these, and while the research is still emerging, there are a handful of studies on the effects. I think it's actually just 2 studies on the biological effects of this fishery and how it relates to the shark populations as a whole. There's a lot of data on the recreational boat-based fishery, which actually contributed to more harvest than commercial over the past few years, which is very interesting. But there's also literature saying that understanding the human element of these fisheries, which my research attempted to do, is very important in also managing, because these are the people that are actually going to be engaging in the fishery. And if it's at 2 a.m. in the morning on a beach in the middle of nowhere, like it's not like you're gonna have a game warden out there telling them what to do and what not to do.
So Cole, it says here that after graduation, you plan on heading to Brazil for a month to do some surfing and fishing, which is very exciting, and maybe some shark fishing as well. I'm not sure. But one of the other things that you mentioned was that once you return, you'll be both working on your sustainable eyewear business, as well as helping a federal PAC you co-founded get ready to assist progressive candidates in the next midterm elections. Just tell us a little bit about that.
So that means that I have a few options and I have no idea what I'm going to do. But the few different side projects that I've been working on, like political stuff and like business stuff, they all sort of interest me, and obviously this interests me. So we'll see what happens, but yeah.
Well, indeed, and I'm sure it does sound like you have lots of great options ahead, and we'll be very excited to see where your path takes you. And so again, please do keep in touch with us over the years, and it's always great to see where our graduates end up. So thank you very much, and great job to all of our presenters for this morning. This was our final morning presentation. We're going to be taking a bit of a lunch break, but we will be back with another slate of great presentations right at 1 p.m. So be sure to log back out. It'll be this Zoom link. So thanks so much to our presenters, and we'll see you at 1 p.m.